One area that's been a particular area of focus has been related to immunotherapy.
Yeah.
So immunotherapy is by almost any standard, a wonder drug for different forms of cancer, in that these are used in often used in really difficult to treat cancers. They're often very tragic cases. For instance, they might be young people with very advanced melanoma that spread to different organ systems, but they use them for a wide variety of cancers, and they're difficult to treat. And these immunotherapies, they when they work, they can work really spectacularly for cancers that we had no treatment for before. We didn't even know the gut microbiome was relevant for anything 10 or 20 years ago. And not only have we got here, a drug that has come from nowhere that is brilliant for some people, has won the Nobel Prize, etc. But now we've discovered that the gut microbiome is entirely relevant to how this drug functions or not. Interested parties will be aware of the many steps for getting to that New England paper. The diligent cell work, the mouse work that's gone on for generations, the steps of funding, the presentation of conferences. And here, this was like a sledgehammer. People might have had some awareness of the gut microbiome and manipulation, and then out of the blue, like the carpet is pulled by a paper being published of you did what to people, and then not only did you do this to people, but it worked as well. The first patient we treated was someone who, just to describe them broadly, was someone who'd basically been in and out of hospital, an elderly patient who'd been in and out of hospital for 6 months, and we had treated them. The patient had not been totally convinced at first, taken a little bit of time to consider whether FMT was right for them, and I think we kind of went on that journey with them of explaining what we thought were the pros and cons, and recognizing that it was new. And then gradually, from about 3 days onwards, the patient's diarrhea started to resolve. So of course we didn't really know, is this just kind of a bit of vancomycin hangover from what the patients had before? Okay. Is it just they've got lucky at that point in time or whatever, But then gradually, every hour turning into day that went by where the patient was still all right, it became kind of more and more likely that, this might have actually worked.
The following is a conversation with Dr. Benjamin Mullish, an NIHR academic clinical lecturer at Imperial College London, an honorary registrar in gastroenterology at hepatology at St Mary's Hospital in London. Dr. Mullish is widely accepted as being a pioneer of the application of fecal microbiota transplantation, also known as intestinal microbiota transfer, to patient populations. Dr. Mullish was one of the co-first authors of the BSG HIS consensus guideline publications, the application of FMT to treat disease. Dr. Mullish is a widely experienced pioneer in the field of FMT-IMT, having been involved in multiple randomized controlled studies, as well as the application of FMT on a named patient basis. This is Inside Matters. My name is Dr. James McElroy. I hope you enjoy it. Why don't we start with you talking about your FMT experience?
Yeah.
How did you get started with FMT?
Okay, so I think it was when I was, because my background's obviously clinical, working in so GI disease, gastroenterology and liver disease. And it was about 10 years ago when I started getting into research, had the opportunity to take some time out of clinical training. And there were kind of a couple of things that were dovetailing at the same time. The first aspect of it was a sort of explosion of interest in the contribution of the gut microbiome to disease. That was kind of becoming a really hot topic at the time. And the other aspect of that was this sort of gradual but then precipitous increase in interest about fecal transplants. So when I think it was back in January 2013 that the first randomized New England trial was published, and that was kind of about the time that I was around and getting engaged with research. And I think it was those two things kind of dovetailing together. Firstly, the this huge explosion in awareness, the sort of breakthrough points about microbiome science, and secondly, this interest in FMT. So the idea of them being a sort of almost new branch of science, and the fact that you could actually do something therapeutic at the same time was pretty attractive.
And was this the Van Nood paper?
Precisely. Yeah, precisely. I mean, you don't really hear okay, everyone would accept that was a small randomized, small trial, albeit randomized. But you don't often hear things in, trials in medicine that are stopped by an ethics board and interim analysis because people in a treatment arm are doing so much better than people being given standard of care.
So what happened in the Van Nood? I think the title is Duodenal Infusion of Donor Feces for Recurrent C.difficile or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I remember reading it as a medical student and was like, what?
Yes. Yeah.
What?
I think
they've done what? They've instilled donor feces into the small bowel?
I mean, I think what's unusual for this is normally if there's any sort of intervention in medicine, interested parties will be aware of the many steps for getting to that New England paper. The diligent cell work, the mouse work that's gone on for generations, the steps of funding, the presentation of conferences. And here, this was like a sledgehammer. People might have had some awareness of the gut microbiome and manipulation, and then out of the blue, like the carpet is pulled by, a paper being published of you did what to people, and then not only did you do this to people, but it worked as well.
And New England Journal of Medicine.
Yeah, precisely.
That's big, isn't it?
Yeah, precisely. And it was a simple intervention. This isn't people having really complex intervention. This was really basic. I think the donors in this were people who had what by today's standards was seen pretty primitive screening, being given fresh stool. I think some of these were volunteers in the hospital, who were giving out sweets and newspapers to patients and visitors.
We wouldn't do that anymore.
No, this wasn't this wasn't like super sophistication. This was really basic, and exactly as you say, by today's standards in terms of safety, quality of preparation, it looks pretty basic, but it was a real sledgehammer.
Let's make a note. We won't do it right now, but we'll try and come back to the evolution of all elements associated with preparing the formulation that's used within IMT, FMT, because it has come on honestly so much, hasn't it? And I know that yourself and Prof. Marchese's team in Imperial are really big on also figuring out how this works. So we should talk about that too. But going back to 2012 then, you read it and you thought, whoa. And what happened next?
Yeah, so I mean, when I started to try and get an FMT, IMT service sort of up in the hospital I work, there were, some predictable barriers. I mean, kind of within the, I work in a centre where there's a very big active digestive disease research community. Those guys bought in pretty quickly. But having to go through the kind of levels of, regulation within the trust and beyond to try and get a program set up was pretty formidable. I mean, firstly, from a regulatory standpoint, there was the time point whereby some people, you'll certainly remember, James, where people were talking about, this is fall under the remit of the EU tissue and cells remit, or HTA or MHR, or MHRA. There was still some head scratching about that.
We had that conference, didn't we, in 2014? I remember now. Yes,
that's right. So that there was some head scratching about that. Even, what the approach was to, kind of implement this in our trust. To give a basic example, after some real backwards and forwards, I was told this landed with the Drugs and Therapeutics Committee. And the Drugs and Therapeutics Committee said, no, this would fall within a sort of research remit capacity. Everyone was kind of unsure about, whose remit was this. Because, there was no kind of parallel to this. I mean, there's certainly things that are used in clinical practice that are hard to classify, using leeches on vascular patients and those sort of things. It wasn't unprecedented that there were things that are kind of effective, but you don't know whose remit they lie. So but this was pretty...
On that note, you've just reminded me of something quite funny. I've done some work with a lady who works in regulatory affairs, and she helps us with our endeavors, and what we're doing and what you're doing is obviously very different to your traditional medicine. You're not trying to preserve sterility. You're trying to maintain the viability of the microorganism. Sure. So she always talks about it being unusual, but she says that she has worked on something more unusual, which is someone that was trying to grow worms in a GMP setting. Right. Because there's some evidence to suggest that if there's worms or helminths in your gut, there's less autoimmunity. Right, okay. Yeah. And apparently it started with this guy in a shed and he was distributing it, and then the regulator came in and were like, look, you can't do this anymore.
Yeah, I think we tested the coronaries of our plenty of committees as it was. I don't know what that was sort of.
So GMP worms.
Yeah, GMP worms.
There we go. So going back, so there was red tape, but were you convinced at that point that, just based on that study, that this was going to be big?
No, I don't think I was at that stage. I mean, it's pretty familiar to anyone with a clinical background that the real world experience of certain interventions can be pretty different to how they're presented in papers. That all papers have pretty stringent inclusion and exclusion criteria. You often don't see the original data, etc., etc. So I think, like everyone, while I was pretty taken by the claims, they almost seemed too good to be true, and it almost seemed too abstract to actually work. So I was kind of, unless I'd seen it with my own eyes, it was I wasn't convinced yet.
When was the first time you saw FMT with your own eyes?
Yeah, so I think it was the first patient we treated was someone who, just to describe them broadly, was someone who'd basically been in and out of hospital, an elderly patient who'd been in and out of hospital for 6 months. Family reported to become sort of profoundly debilitated in terms of weight loss, appetite, interaction, mood. Had other comorbidities that had worsened, had lived independently but wasn't able to, probably weren't going to be able to live in their own home anymore due to their kind of debilitation. And we had treated them. The patient had not been totally convinced at first, taken a little bit of time to consider whether FMT was right for them. And I think we kind of went on that journey with them of explaining what we thought were the pros and cons, and recognizing that it was new. But treated the patient. At first few days, we didn't see anything, any kind of real profound benefit. And then gradually, from about 3 days onwards, the patient's diarrhea started to resolve. So of course we didn't really know, is this just kind of a bit of vancomycin hangover from what the patients had before?
Okay.
Is it just they've got lucky at that point in time or whatever, But then gradually, every hour turning into day that went by where the patient was still all right, it became kind of more and more likely that, this might have actually worked. A kind of further interesting aspect to that is the patient then did go home. They managed to go back to their own home with a sort of package of care in place, and then bizarrely reattended A&E about 2 weeks later because of constipation.
Really?
Yeah, they came back to A&E because they were pretty uncomfortable.
One extreme to another.
Yeah. And in fact, that is something that we've noticed with a few of our early patients and subsequent patients as well. So, that was real kind of jaw on the floor, kind of moment. Yeah.
Fascinating. So, for this first patient, were you like, doing your shift, see them in the morning, see them in the afternoon, next day you come back, you're like, whoa, they're looking much better? Was kind of what was going on? Or?
I don't think there was any kind of overall in the first few days, some kind of like profound miraculous moment. But then there was suddenly, almost insidiously some sort of inflection point where you kind of, I don't know, that maybe it was just like the light had gone on or something had changed. You just kind of got a sense that something had changed. It was maybe in something in the patient's interaction with you, or that it was kind of a global thing, like the patient's general interaction with you. Their blood tests had got much better, inflammatory markers dropped that day. Appetite was better. They were on the phone to family. There was just seemed to be something that had happened. Can I clearly say with one person that was definitely all FMT related? No, I can't. But it was just that kind of sense, and I think it was kind of that was enough to kind of, if not fully win me over, give me the impression, this looks promising.
This could be big.
Yeah.
So that stimulated and sparked an interest for you then, and you've done a huge amount of work, both in terms of pioneering the application of FMT in various different diseases and patient populations, but you've also helped craft the consensus guidelines, which are so important, and other fundamental aspects to getting these products to patients. So take me further then along the journey, to where we are today with regards to FMT, and how did it go from patient 1 to more, and how did the field evolve as well over the course of that time?
Okay, so I think having got that, I mean, again, another aspect to this is we were working on pretty basic funding. It was a few scraps of funds here and a few scraps of funds there. This wasn't something being consistently funded by either research or NHS funds. And gradually, as we kind of started to build a kind of case of people that we treated, and the results seemed to be, pretty convincing. We then started to get approached from another, local regional hospital who also has a sort of bank of people they've been keeping going on vancomycin and flutamycin who they wanted us to treat. So we kind of did a flurry of those at the same time.
So just for the listeners, vanc and flutamycin are antibiotics, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. So they are the two of the most widely used anti-C. diff antibiotics. Yeah. And we treated those patients, and they did well as well. And it was kind of at that point that I think we said, look, almost we need to take this a bit more.
Right.
we need to take this a bit. We need to be a bit more robust in how we're doing this, because it was still, a fairly basic operation. Like perhaps other people you've spoken to, you remember, it was we didn't have some sort of slick homogenizer like we do now. We were starting with glorified blenders to make things up.
Yep.
It was really basic.
And we had I'm going to try and get him on, but Dr. Alistair McConaughey.
Ah, okay, yeah. Well, I think
he was using a protein shaker.
Yeah, and in fact, it was his.
He was pioneering.
It was his
wasn't
case series, which I think was back from 2009.
Yes.
That I think that lots of people kind of, certainly from a UK perspective, sat up and took notice of. And to come back to that idea of what you sometimes see in a very slick big paper is sometimes different from real world experience.
Right.
What he described was real world experience, because he was describing elderly, frail, multi-morbid patients who are exactly the sort of phenotype of patients that we were seeing, which to us, added validity, because he thought, okay, what we're seeing here is what we've seen. This is someone who's a British operation. They're seeing exactly the same sort of phenotype of patients we recognise, and it's working.
It's working.
Yeah. So I think that also created a bit of validity in our mind in the early stages.
So during the early stages, it sounds to me like it was the clinicians and the kind of the people who straddle, like yourself, between the benchtop science and the application of therapies to patients, who were actually not only applying the treatment, but you were creating the treatment. You were manufacturing, right? So what guidance was there for you guys back then around how do you actually do this?
Yeah, so at the time there was sort of over a pretty short period of time, there were a number of papers published by Mike Sadowski and colleagues in Minnesota, and Matt Hamilton and Alex Karutz, and lots of
Eliane Youngster, sorry, beg your pardon. Sorry,
so, and lots of those papers, concerned bread and butter things such as prep of your FMT, including use of glycerol as a cryopreservative. So in other words, that this chemical we add to try and keep the bacteria in sort of suspended animation in the freezer. And those sort of aspects, were really helpful, because they were kind of a bit more practical, pragmatic. We're trying to take things forward. And of course, that sort of idea of then using frozen preparation, not fresh, that was pretty widely adapted by everyone in the early days.
So walk us through that then. So the fresh was...
Yeah. Okay.
You just process. Well,
you get a donation on the day from someone. Yeah. In the early days, remember, there was a lot of you might choose a donor yourself. You might pick your spouse and all that kind of stuff, and you'd wait for them to deliver on the day. Yeah. Maybe they'd had a little bit of screening, but generally it was just to emphasise a lot more basic than we would recognise now. And just processed on the day, and then are sort of immediately administered. Yeah. But of course, those kind of Alex Karutz, Mike Sadowski papers. There's guys from Minnesota and beyond, who then gave these sort of protocols for you can actually prepare your FMT in advance and stick it in a freezer. Those were. I mean, it sounds pathetic, but those were really big game-changing things for us. Yeah. I mean, one, it meant that you could. I mean, from a safety perspective, it was very important, because it meant, look, you can pick someone you want, you can screen them at a time that's apposite for you, and you can prepare in front. Prepare in front. So from a safety aspect of being able to pre-screen someone was really helpful. And secondly, just for the convenience of saying that you could just have you could get a material out the freezer on the day that you need it. I mean, there were other sort of bizarre things as well. I mean, perhaps you've noticed with your donors, there is a sort of in the early days when we had a pretty small bank of donors, there was this kind of like performance anxiety, where people said, I've got to produce a sample on the day, or this patient with C. diff might not get treated, and then really worried that the night before that they were kind of should I be mainlining probiotics, stay off the curry, run a 10K, so I'm in the best shape possible to donate tomorrow, and then sheepishly contact you on the morning saying it hasn't
not
happened,
happening, man.
So that was as wacky as that sounds, that's where it was at.
So I can give some perspective from our experience, and as you know, we collect donations every day from quite a large pool of people now at our operation, and we do find that it does take a little bit of time to kind of get into the groove and get into the rhythm. Yep. That makes sense. So this kind of, I think there's definitely, of course, a link between the gut and the brain.
Sure.
I think most of the communication goes up. I've heard it's 80%, but I'm not sure how strong that is. Maybe need to ask Debbie Shawcross and co. But there's definitely some element of stress, pressure, anxiety that does impact on your bowel movements. And if you're being told, and this is back then, hey, you have to, otherwise we can't give person X who may be related to you or a partner their treatment, that's quite a big thing, isn't it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, exactly.
So the invention of this, or the realization that we could apply a cryoprotectant and that frozen worked just as well, I think was a bit of a revelation for everybody.
Yeah.
But how did we know then that it was as good? Like, what was the evidence base that existed then? Because we had the Van Nude, and then we had some others, didn't we? Yeah,
that's right. So there were. I mean, so some of that is clinical. In other words, that's showing that fresh versus frozen was a position of equipoise. That was as good as each other, which repeated in a kind of a number of different settings.
Right.
And some of that was kind of microbiological, where people had put frozen material in the freezers, particularly from the Finnish group. I remember the sort of early papers, they put their FMT in the freezer for a while, up to 6 months or even longer in some cases, taking them out and look for aspects such as using sequencing or culture to try and check what bacteria, what microorganisms are there, and are they comparable to what we had at the beginning. And they seem broadly comparable with a few subtle differences, but seem broadly comparable. So I think it was those two things. Studies showing that one, what you stuck in the freezer was what you got out at 6 months. Looking at at least from a particular perspective, and secondly from a clinical experience perspective, that both fresh, that the frozen seems as good. Yeah.
Fast forwarding to today, and I'll go back again after this, but are we still of the view that fresh and frozen is comparable, or is there like any schools of thought that says no, it has to be fresh for whatever reason?
Yeah, I don't think I know anyone who would advocate in any enthusiastic way for fresh in any capacity, and from so many aspects, but those that we've discussed already. But I mean, principally in terms of the safety of and the efficiency of the process, principally safety. But I just do not know that there is anyone who would advocate for fresh at all. Or I think we had made when we'd written up, just to go back to what you mentioned before about the BSG HIS guidelines. I think when we done the last version of the guidelines, we had made some allusion to fresh, but not strongly advocated for it. Remember, when you write a guideline, you do have to think about the different settings and the different pushes and pulls in which people operate, and that in a well-resourced teaching hospital may be different to different settings. And while we're never advocating for a reduction in safety, we do have to accept that there's a balance of risks and benefits in different settings. So we did mention fresh there. Lots of subsequent guidelines have really downplayed the role of fresh for exactly all the reasons we've discussed.
Right. So in terms of the guidelines and the field progressing internationally, is it fair to say that in terms of regulation and guidance, there wasn't anything sort of formal from the competent authorities like the MHRA, HTA, FDA, and in the first instance, it was these consensus papers that came up to help guide the clinicians and the manufacturers. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that is a fair description. Yeah, exactly.
So how did you go about producing the first draft of the consensus guidelines for the UK?
Yeah, so there were a few elements at play at the same time. So there'd been a number of sort of meetups of interested stakeholders and parties. I remember you've been very active in those discussions where the MHRA was represented, and I think all of us saying, look, we recognise we've got something novel here, but how are we really going to take this forward unless we have some sort of guideline or recommendation for how to do this? No one is saying that the guideline we might come up with is the final finished all singing or dancing project. It's a field in evolution, but we need some sort of flag in the sand, particularly in terms of safety of our patients. And the other aspect was a growing interest in research and where FMT might fit in a research environment. Certainly I know when I went to funders or whatever in the early days of this, they were saying, you're going to do what, and you want to research what, and what guidelines where is this, where is there any guideline saying this is something that has any sort of standard of care, or whenever you're saying you want to do research, particularly from a clinical perspective, you typically go along and say, look, this is we've got a guideline that says this is the standard of care, but we accept there are some big gaps in the knowledge base, and this is how we want to advance them. And we couldn't do that, and so I think that was potentially risking us being paralysed in terms of moving on from a research perspective. That from our point of view, from your point of view, from any other's point of view, has been so important to our our fields of interest. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you convened the interested parties.
Yeah.
And then my understanding is that it was a huge amount of work to get to the output. So how did you make sure that all the key elements were sort of contained within the document?
Yeah.
And also there must have been some contentious points.
Yeah, okay. So there we I think because it was something new, what was to our advantage is there were a lot of interested stakeholders. There were a lot of people who were enthusiastic about playing a role in it. So I remember an initial scoping meeting where there was an enormous breadth of representative parties, almost too many people wanting to have a finger in the pie, and an enormous number of people want to say that to have some contribution to it. I suppose we did have some basis for how to structure it, because there were already a couple of kind of consensus documents or a couple of early guidelines that were out there, which gave us some sort of shape for what a consensus document might or a guideline might look like. And the people we were working with, British Society of Gastroenterology and the Healthcare Infection Society, were supportive in that they already have a pretty robust framework for how they want guidelines done. For instance, HIS are very rigorous on using methodology similar to NICE in how they approach things. They are very rightly pedantic about the kind of quality of guidelines. So they provide us with a framework and structure as well.
Got it. And what areas were contentious?
Yes. Okay.
I'm sure there's a few.
Yeah. I think as it always is, that donor screening.
The donor screening element.
Screening was a sort of particular area of interest. I remember when we were writing the guidelines, it'd been about a year earlier, there'd been some updating UK guidelines regarding multi-drug resistant bacteria and their carriage within gut. And it was a time when many of us, particularly working in urban centres, who were doing rectal screening or stool screening on people coming into hospital as acute cases, or people coming in for surgery or whatever, were seeing these enormous explosions of people testing positive for multi-drug resistant organisms. I remember that was a big one, a particular kind of area of debate. But even smaller things, should we be, it was also a kind of inflection point for what assays people were using. Should we be using culture, or should we be using PCR based assays, or so what we screen for, how we screened for it. And while cost effectiveness wasn't part of our remit, there were certainly people from a whole range of different backgrounds, from people from some more well-resourced hospitals and centres, and people who were really working hard to try and keep a smaller scale FMT operation together, who said, look, this will cripple us, we'll never have any donors if we have to do this sort of stuff. So there were a number of different pushes and pulls and different factors to balance.
Do you think it's a natural evolution for some of the smaller groups and facilities and so on to sort of move out to, or sort of start using the bigger ones, or do you think that hospitals should always maintain a practice because it keeps people current and they have access to material when they need it and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think there's a potential role for both, but I think if we look at other aspects of specialized aspects of of clinical medicine, particularly that might be related to some sort of therapeutic delivery, perhaps stem cell transplant as an example.
Yeah.
There might be something whereby it's very reasonable for someone locally to kind of give you an opinion or to provide some aspect of your your care or provide input to your care, but actually to receive the therapy and have the sort of most intensive input and actually get the therapy itself, you might do from a specialist centre for a number of reasons. One is pooling expertise, and two is the resource required to kind of keep the centre going,
Right.
be that a stool bank or a stem cell transplant centre or whatever that is.
Yep.
So I think there was a clear move for most people's mind to kind of however you want to refer to that, like a hub and spoke model, sometimes referred to, as that being the way forward. And I don't think there was any kind of particular resistance from anyone about that.
That makes sense. And I suppose one other element is that smaller centres or different centres might have particular expertise in disease areas and patient populations, and therefore them being able to pioneer their own microbiome research, their own capability sees quite reasonable, I suppose.
Yeah, and there's other aspects, that kind of feed into that as well. That, for instance, as someone who's kind of just on the tail end of their clinical training after
What does that mean?
After a decade or so.
That means you're close to consultant, yeah?
But there's lots of people who will then spend some time training in a specialist centre, and then will have other elements of their training in a smaller centre or whatever. And if they can bring the expertise they've learned in one centre and use it productively in another centre, great. Why shouldn't they do it? I mean, I think while there is kind of a role for both based on a lot of local factors, that kind of hub or spoke or centralised model is got a lot of advantages.
It's probably a good point in time now to revisit the changes in rigour and robustness and stringency from back in 2012, say 2013, with that first paper from Van Nu, to where we are kind of today in terms of the numbers of different pathogens we look for, the quality of the assays, the GMP facilities, that kind of thing. So what's changed and sort of what's been the evolution?
The donor screening is clearly the major aspect. Those factors we've touched on already, including what you screen for, how you screen on them, and undoubtedly the breadth of what you screen for. I think there's a couple of things that particularly fed into that. One was this kind of the sort of Boston experience of multi-drug resistant organism transmission in a small number of patients, ESBL, E. coli transmission in a small number of immunosuppressed patients in a trial in Boston, of which patients got invasive disease and one of the patients died. I mean, it's
a big moment for us, wasn't it?
I think that's obviously was a big wake-up call for everyone in the community about not where perhaps there was an element of complacency of screening, creeping in before that.
And may I also just touch on DIY FMT at this point, because it's like there are videos on YouTube where people give instructions to other people to say, look, you can do this in your kitchen, but whilst you might be able to collect a stool sample and subject it to some level of processing in your kitchen, there are risks associated with this, real risks that have been proven now. So, I mean, on the DIY thing, do you speak to patients who've tried or want to try, or is it less than...
I occasionally, I get less than I used to, but I used to get a lot of emails from people saying, I am in absolute dire straits with some sort of GI or liver-related disease, predominantly. It could be some other diseases. And I'm aware about the gut microbiome being contributory. I feel I've exhausted all conventional medical avenues for it. My life is, my quality of life is extremely poor. And I am so desperate that I'm going to give this a try, basically, and asking for a bit of steer or a bit of advice, or really kind of wanting, this is okay. Me to say this is okay, isn't it? And it's a difficult position for a clinician, because on the one hand, I could see here was someone completely desperate. In many cases, they really had exhausted a long list of lines of medical therapy with minimal benefit. However, I couldn't give them the answer they wanted to hear. I couldn't say to them,
Sure.
"Yeah, I think this is a good idea," because in my mind, the risks of adverse outcomes, be those risk of infection, be those some sort of physical damage to themselves via administration or whatever those risks are, in my mind, those risks outweighed any potential benefit. So I replied to people, and it was always a difficult discussion, because I just couldn't say to them, I couldn't say to them, yes, I think this is a good idea, because I didn't. I always thought the risks outweighed the benefits.
Do we have somewhere for these people to go now in the UK, or is it still, because we don't have an approved treatment yet,
I think the answer to that is yes and no. And the way I say that, the reason I say that is because even when FMT has been at a fairly early stage, and even smaller scale centres, like it's been the case for large parts of our existence, where people have worked on a pharmacy exemption, providing FMT on particular circumstances to particular patients. There's always been a proviso that comes with that, in that you can kind of make a decision about patients within your professional care, about whether FMT might be appropriate on a sort of compassionate case-by-case basis. And in fact, some of the consensus documents that I've been involved in, from led by Gianluca Iannero in Rome and other colleagues.
He's coming on next week, so
have also
need to make sure the mic's not
Yeah.
too close, because he's so animated
he's
and passionate.
Guy.
Yeah, really
but this was also kind of hot topic of discussion when we formulated there, that it's a different scenario, someone emailing you saying, I want to do a DIY FMT myself, to you being a professional clinician assessing someone professionally, recognizing that you are providing screened FMT that you think you are producing to a particular standard, then discussing in a multidisciplinary team setting about whether FMT IMT would be appropriate for that particular patient, balancing that particular patient's risks and benefits. And we've used it in that setting. I think a number of other centres have used it in that setting. In fact, some of our work, perhaps we'll get onto it, perhaps we won't, about multi-drug resistance, etc., kind of evolved from that situation originally. And so that is a kind of different scenario, a completely different scenario to DIY FMT, and that clearly seems to have a place.
Totally. What actually really drove me to get going with enterobiotics was I came across the DIY FMT, and I also spoke to a clinician in Edinburgh who sort of said, so you doing FMT? So, yeah, it's great, it's fantastic. My C. diff patients are getting better. I said, that's great. And I said, well, how are you doing it? He said, well, I'll go down to B&Q and pick up a blender and I do it in the ward. And I just thought, there has to be a better way.
Yes, yeah.
We've got patients that need this. And we have infrastructure, engineering, we've got some, knowledge from other fields. Surely we can apply that together and create something that makes it safer, more accessible, and ultimately better. So it was the DIY element plus the hearing of doctors doing it themselves. So it made me think, whoa, I would like to try and help and create a company that makes it better for people.
I mean, as a kind of slight parallel to that, I realise it's not a perfect analogy, but we all recognise the role for blood transfusion.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't say, if you wouldn't say, well, I'm critically ill, just give me any old blood. Doesn't matter if you've screened for hepatitis B or not.
Right.
You would still expect that the blood has been screened to a very high standard.
Right.
And the risks and benefits of you having a blood transfusion because you're in hospital and your blood count's dropped a little bit low is different for you having a road traffic accident and half your circulation on the floor of A&E. But we all still expect, no one would argue that the quality has to be as good.
Totally.
And by it's not a perfect analogy, but it but you can see the parallels in that regardless of scenario, regardless of the risks and benefits, there clearly needs to be very high standards of the quality of the product you're giving when you're talking about giving people biological materials.
Totally. We should be striving to do the very best we can at present with the knowledge that we have, and then striving to innovate and improve moving forwards, ultimately for the benefit of patients everywhere. I mean, I personally think that everybody on this planet can benefit from microbiome modulation, not necessarily FMT, IMT, but everyone's got a microbiome. It plays important roles in every single person, and there must be ways that we can tweak and improve. For some patients, they need the FMT, IMT. So let us work together to create something that has maximum impact and minimal risk for these people. So going back to donor screening then, so we talked about the MDROs. How else has our knowledge evolved on donor screening? And so it sounds like we're testing for a lot more now.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I was going to say, I think I started by saying perhaps two kind of time points which made us take a bit of a wake-up call. Number one was regarding MDRO screening. I think number two was regarding COVID. Now, I think pretty early on, we all realised, particularly when those sort of early papers started coming out about, people having GI symptoms related to COVID, prolonged excretion of SARS-CoV-2 in stool, that I think very early on, I can remember actually in March 2020, we put out our first consensus document that was, looking back at it now, was pretty bland, but was basically the idea of it was to put a flag in the sand to say, guys, we might have a problem here and we need to think about it. Now, I'm not, as it happened, I think we kind of traversed COVID. I wouldn't say we've completely got a grip as lots of people haven't for large aspects of medicine, but we've got a safe approach. We have really robust assays for testing for SARS-CoV-2 in stool. We know about screening our donors, etc.
And the vaccine
we consider vaccination. But I think that was part of a kind of larger wake up call, if you will, to us thinking about again recognizing we cannot sit on our laurels about donor screening. And I think really the wake up call there is that this is exactly as you've said, in evolution. That we can't say we've got the finished product, we've got the perfect screening tool, and that's it. Case book closed. That's what we're going to do for the rest of the time. That was a wake-up call that we need to be nimble and keep our eye out for new threats and for things that are evolving the whole time, and that we kind of need to keep this under constant review and as things develop. In a parallel to that, there have been, as soon as the alert was sounded over monkeypox, there have been a number of very active email chains about, look, does this have any implications for us? And I was pleased to see that people were immediately, that the alarm bells went off immediately. Here's a new pathogen. What are the implications for us as it applies to donor screening or beyond? And I think as traumatic from so many aspects that SARS-CoV-2 and COVID has been, that perhaps it has put in our minds we need to be fluid. We need to kind of keep alert about new things we need to test for and how we can do better the whole time.
I suppose one of the other elements or benefits associated with freezing is there can be some quarantine period built in. I mean, at the end of the day, though, I think we probably need to accept that we're never going to be able to screen for everything, and there are going to be emerging threats that appear from time to time that are endemic in a particular geography where your donors are, and you have to mitigate against that through questionnaire and ideally some sort of testing, right? So the current thing here on monkeypox is assessing risky behaviour and
precisely.
If obviously it's any physical symptoms and signs.
Precisely that. I think what we're saying is that a lot of the a number of different risk factors that apply to monkeypox acquisition are parts that are relevant to parts of the questionnaire and health screening for donor screening more generally, and will actually kind of keep the risk pretty minimal there. Exactly as you say, there is debate ongoing about do we need to push harder than that, in terms of potentially testing, etc. But I think the first kind of slight sigh of relief that we got is recognizing that probably that lots of those questions we asked for about donor risk factors are going to overlap with a lot of risk factors for monkeypox and minimize risk pretty considerably from that aspect. That makes a lot of sense. So going back a step then to the donor screening, how are you putting together the consensus guidelines for donor screening and the remainder of the protocols and procedures at the moment? Because there's been, I suppose maybe you can give some context for the listener, just how much
research has come out. Since your last one.
Yeah, okay. So to give us all, to answer that very broadly, we have two sections of the guidelines we're kind of looking at. One is related to FMT principally for C. diff or an FMT service more generally. And the second aspect is looking at FMT in the context of non-C. diff conditions. And the first protocol when you're writing the guideline is you pull everything published since your last guideline, and you have a look at what's there.
And is it yourself that's leading this with Nabil?
Yeah, that's right, with Nabil and colleagues at St Thomas's.
Yeah.
And for the FMT C. diff question, we've reviewed about 8,000 different publications already on the first screen. And for the sort of non-C. diff, since 1st of January 2018. And remember, 2 years of that, people weren't really receiving a big chunk of 2 years. People, trolls for FMT and non-C. diff settings were downscaled
because of the COVID.
Because of COVID, yeah. But nevertheless, we've managed to find over 11,000 abstracts to 11,000 papers to screen. So it is.
So you saying that that's quite a bigger number than I was expecting you to say. So has there been 11,000 publications releasing to FMT over the last 4 years?
Well, again, keeping with that rigorous structure, we have to pull everything that's reported as a conference, everything that is reported in the medical literature in any meaningful capacity. We have to at least at least give it some sort of degree of consideration. And basically, since 1st January 2018, on even a first glance, we've got about almost 20,000, publications in some shape or form to cast our eye over.
Goodness gracious! So 20,000. So hold on a second. 18,000 for C. diff and 11,000.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So over 11,000 for non-C. diff, and near to 8,000 for.
Wow, this is incredible. Nobody's ever going to get through all of that, right?
So what we do when we pull the literature is we put our eyes onto every, the first few lines of every publication. A lot of it is immediately clear it's not rigorous enough, it's not relevant enough for us to consider for the guideline. But we, for due diligence for the process, we have to at least have at least two people, often three people, cast their eyes on every single one of those.
Wow! So you're going to have read 20,000 abstracts.
Yeah, so we've just done the sift. Now, the vast majority of those, to put it in context, the vast majority of those are not relevant enough, or not high quality enough, or not contributory enough for us to kind of consider the whole publication for the guideline.
Yeah.
It's only a small proportion of that kind of makes the cut.
Has there been anything super cool that you've seen that I can just press you on? A lot of it is cool, and I know I'm going to get to your work at Imperial with Julian and colleagues, because it's well, to use my phraseology, super cool. But 20,000, anything jump out at you like, whoa, that's mad?
I don't think I can't think of a perfect example offhand. I mean, I suppose the breadth of non-CDI work that is carrying on, and I say breadth in terms of means of preparation, more creative forms of donor selection, indications for administration, tentacles in which the microbiome might appear to have a role as a contribution to disease. I suppose those are the kind of elements that kind of jump out at you on a screen. Yeah.
So, big question for you: what makes a good donor?
Yeah. Okay. Well.
Okay. We could be here for the rest of the day.
How long have we got?
We could be here for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to be honest, we could do tons of episodes on this. And I'll tell you what, I'll strike a few off for you based on my experience. So, I'll start with the less scientific stuff. So, obviously, someone that donates frequently could be a good donor.
Yeah.
Okay. Someone who donates large amounts of stool every time they donate could be a good donor.
Yeah.
Somebody who always passes the daily health check questionnaire could be a good donor. Somebody whose stool always fits within what I'll call the most high level assessments of quality. So Bristol Stool Score, I guess for the listener, we and you do, it's in the Consensus guidelines. There's a visual appearance check on the stool to make sure that there's not diarrhea or any presence of mucus or any presence of blood, or it's come from someone who's very constipated, so to speak, which could be an indicator of pathology. So I'll give you a few of those. Now, we can get onto what I think would be the more complicated stuff, like, for example,
Well, I'm okay. Well, let me have a go.
Yeah, go.
I mean,
you're the expert.
Well,
I'm just throwing in the company experience.
For instance, a particular field of interest has been about. There was a very high-profile case a few years ago of a patient who received FMT. From their who was
relative,
a thin patient who received FMT from their overweight daughter and put on a lot of weight very rapidly, and that kind of dovetails with a few publications at the same time of microbiome transmissibility related to weight and metabolism. And at that moment in time, there was this flurry of activity that we've cracked it. All you need to do is find someone who fits those kind of criteria you said, who has the right phenotype. So if we want to crack obesity, which obviously has which seems increasingly likely has a microbiome contribution, all we need to do is find a thin donor, basically, and that'll be it. And needless to say, it hasn't been that simple.
So I'll add something to this, and I'll press you on what evidence there is for weight loss through FMT. I've also seen from Max Newdorp's group, I believe, a paper in cancer cachexia.
Right, okay, yeah.
And they specifically chose obese donors, I believe.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And I think scientifically it all goes back to the Jeff Gordon OB mouse study in Nature, which basically showed you can transfer an obese or lean phenotype through FMT. And they showed that it had, in the case of the obese mouse, more efficiency in energy harvest, so it could extract more calories from the food or whatever. So I remember this as well because there was all the Daily Mail headlines.
Right.
You want to get thin, take an FMT pill. But I don't think we've seen that translate, have we? Into...
Okay. So I mean, there are a number of studies that have looked at FMT in the context of pure obesity alone, and they haven't shown that they clearly haven't had a positive outcome in terms of FMT from a thin donor or a healthy donor or whatever, that transfer of phenotype that you would have seen in that you appear to see in a mouse setting. They've shown other proxies that are promising in terms of some microbiome changes towards kind of more in inverted commas favorable microbiome elements, and changes in aspects of microbiome functionality look promising. So, but they haven't actually shown weight loss. You can make a number of different comments on that. One might be, is the way, lots of these non-CDI studies in obesity and beyond have just said, well, look, let's extrapolate the way we prep an FMT for C. diff and use it here. Maybe we need to do something a little bit different. I mean, for instance, to give one example, you and me have had a debate. Others have had a debate about the role of anaerobic preparation, where most of our colonic bacteria are anaerobic. Not a big deal for C. diff, seems to work without, but maybe it is important as we start to move on to more nuanced disorders. So maybe there's aspects of the preparation, and we're getting a false negative, but increasingly as studies are replicated and we kind of see the same pattern again, it kind of, the take home message is that we need to do a bit better. That's not working. Another interpretation, I mean, as I said there, even if the weight hasn't decreased in these people, maybe that's too hard an endpoint. And actually, the fact that we're seeing some microbiome changes that look beneficial, and we're seeing some metabolome changes that look beneficial, maybe that's a signal. Maybe that's a sign that we are on the right track, but we need to ramp up the game. That that just one FMT or two FMTs or whatever it is just not going to be enough. Yeah, precisely.
So you mentioned the Metabalone. So what is the Metabalone, and what work do you do on maybe selecting a donor based on the Metabalone?
Okay, so our gut, our microbiome of all our mucosal surfaces, my research is focused on the gut microbiome. They are chemical factories. They produce an enormous amount of small molecules or chemicals that often we refer to as metabolites. And we talk about the metabalome, the whole family, the whole collection, the entirety of all these metabolites, these small chemicals. Where do they come from? Some of those are things that the bacteria produce essentially themselves. So, for instance, they could be dietary components that we've eaten that we can't digest ourselves, that they ferment, that they turn from one chemical into another. Some of those, another large chunk of those are things that chemicals we've produced ourselves that the gut bacteria can actually then change. They can chemically transform them. To give two examples, the first category, stuff from our diet we can't digest, we talk about a group of metabolites called short-chain fatty acids that seem to have a really important role in a number of different aspects of our health. And to give an example, the second one is an obvious example is bile. So lots of people will have heard of us making bile and thinking it's something to do with digesting our foods and particularly related to fat or whatever. But we also know that bile has this really complex chemical composition, huge number of different chemicals in there, and that our gut bacteria are able to process those into a whole different family of chemicals, which have whole different sorts of chemical properties and can do a whole load of different things.
Wow, so these are two. So there's two inputs really for the bile acids and the short chain fatty acids, and they're both, I suppose, in some respect, human driven. So for the short chain fatty acids, it's almost like, is it fair to say we eat stuff, and it contains stuff that we can metabolize and break down and give us energy and nutrients and so on.
Yeah.
And then there's this other element, which is the non-digestible component. So that finds its way through our gut, and then the bugs go, oh, here we go. Here's my lunch or my dinner.
Yeah.
And they sort of eat that, and then they produce short chain fatty acids which benefit us.
Yeah.
So it's almost like,
well, exactly. It gets back to this idea of what are the gut bacteria doing there in the
why are they
first
there?
place, and and it comes back to this idea of it's what scientists and doctors talk about a coevolution.
Yeah.
In other words, that for millions of years. We have lived with gut bacteria and they have lived with us, and we kind of rely on each other, as we find in huge other aspects of ecology in the natural world.
Yeah.
So what do? We keep the heating on, very relevant at the moment. We keep the heating on, we keep the acidity right, we keep the plumbing going, so we provide a nice warm environment that's not too acidic, that's not too much the other way for them to live in. And what do they provide us? They produce these chemicals which are useful for them, they're nutrients for them, but they're also as a collateral, they're things that we can use, and we've evolved to use them. So for instance, we talk about those short chain fatty acids, and there's one that we talk about a lot called butyrate, which is sort of one of the major energy sources for the cells lining our large bowel. So we wouldn't have that chemical were it not for the gut bacteria. So it's really important to kind of get a sense of that, that coevolution. Yeah.
So would it be wise then, or is it worth considering, if short chain fatty acids are so important, selecting a donor who's got either loads of short chain fatty acids, because I presume you can measure that, right?
Yeah.
Or lots of bugs who we know produce loads of short chain fatty acids? Like, is that a fair sort of framework, if you like, for rational donor selection?
So I think that's a pretty good start. I think that's a pretty good start. We know that these are important metabolites produced by gut bacteria, and so exactly, selecting out a donor who either has lots of these short chain fatty acids or has lots of bacteria that produce them is really important. I suppose one aspect of that is it's kind of when we talk about short chain fatty acids, we talk about two things. We talk about the material having to be, the dietary material having to be that the bugs produce, and the bugs themselves, and the two are related to each other. But from a donor selection, it can't be someone who is eating a really good diet and has got a lot of short chain fatty acids at one point in time you're screening them, right, and then it's gone off and ate a lot of the fast food straight afterwards, and right, there's that kind of dependency that the bugs are there, and that the what's feeding them is there, that the fuel's there as well.
So should we be, I don't know if we can do this, but asking our donors to eat a particular way, giving them a supplement or whatever?
Okay, so this is a sort of hot area of discussion, and there have been a few small scale kind of reports on what you should you be giving nutritional advice to your donors? Should you be giving nutritional advice to your recipients about it? I mean, in terms of what is published evidence that we know definitely works, the jury is still out. There has been some work from an Israeli study published recently in the big gastroenterology journal.
Elenav.
I can't remember if it was that lab or one of the others.
From the Weizmann.
I think it was from Weizmann, yeah.
They do some pretty cool stuff.
They do some pretty cool stuff. Yeah. I think they've obviously got some pretty broad-minded ethics panels as well. But where they've I think it was a set of overweight and obese people who were given different dietary advice and different supplements for what they should take, and then people had their own, and then were allowed to kind of have a bit more of a free diet and had their own stool collected while they were on that kind of these different diets, and then transferred back into them to see if that could kind of hold their weight or if their weight changed or whatever. So in other words, changing their diet to see if that impacted on their microbiome and if that could have a kind of longer term effect. And there did seem to be a kind of degree of influence, a direct line of interaction between diet, gut microbiome, and then actually, what we call phenotype, in other words, sort of clinical outcome. Yeah.
So a lot of people know what they need to do to become healthier. It's like eat more fruit and veg, cut down on the booze if they drink, stop smoking if they smoke, exercise more and so on. Could it be that, particularly for the dietary element, what's conferring the health benefits that we see phenotypically is a shift in the microbiome towards more short-chain fatty acid producers, more, secondary bile acid producers? And a follow-on from that question, but it's related. Are there elements of the metabolome that we've just not characterized and that could be so important?
Okay, so these are big questions, James.
We've not finished what makes a good donor yet. We're moving nicely.
I think I would answer that like I answered the last question by saying I think these are probably good starts. I think these are probably steps in the right direction, because these are groups of metabolites that we know are beneficial, that are produced by bacteria that are beneficial to our gut. However, to give a sort of really clear binary, it's as simple as it's as simple as that. I think is difficult to say. But I think those are does our diet, are we pretty consistently convinced that those lifestyle improvements translate to microbiome compositional and functional changes associated with health, and could that potentially impact on our health more globally? And is that part of the intermediary of those things improving our health? I think we're kind of getting increasingly confident that is the case. On that second question about metabolome, that second question about characterizing the metabolome. So when we do a lot of analysis where I work in Imperial College, whereby we take samples from pre and post people getting FMT, IMT, or we take samples from people who've had different sorts of healthcare intervention, and we profile their metabolome before and after interventions. And it's what we do is we use these sort of really advanced chemical techniques to try and look for really minute quantities of chemicals present in a particular system. So be that in a poo sample or blood sample or whatever. Yeah. And some of those chemicals, sometimes when we're looking for that analysis, we can say, look, we've definitely found this chemical, we've definitely found that chemical. It's a pretty common scenario where we can say, look, there's something here, we're pretty convinced it's from this family of chemicals. So we think it's a form of bile acid, or we think it's a form of lipid, for instance, but we can't actually, it's at the limit of knowledge to actually specifically put a name on what this actual small chemical, what this metabolite is. However, what we can see is that chemical might really influence, higher levels of that chemical in your gut before an FMT might really influence how well you do, or it might. But we can't actually name what it is. So there are loads. We're in this scenario very common where we can identify chemicals and see that they appear to be relevant to, they might change after a clinical intervention, or they might influence how well you do with a particular intervention. Right. But we can't actually put a name on it. We might be able to say broadly what it is, but we can't definitely pinpoint it.
And is that because no one's ever characterized it before, or?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah. I mean, even this year or over the past year, we've been recognizing, for instance, as I said, I don't go out much and spend a lot of time looking at bile acids, and we've seen like a whole family of bile acids that are sort of bound to amino acids, which is these other kind of real basic building blocks of life that are around in our gut and elsewhere in our bodies. A sort of whole family of these that we kind of didn't know about. So yeah, as time moves on and the sophistication of what we can analyze moves on, then we kind of see more and more detail. But sometimes we're at a stage whereby we are really good at detecting stuff at really minute detail, but we can't even actually label what it is. Yeah, our ability to generate data exceeds our ability to analyze the data.
It's incredible. So on the elements that we don't understand, what is the workflow or the workup to try and identify what it is and then see what it does and so on? Is there a way of doing it?
Yeah, so from the point of view of, just to kind of keep on this topic of metabolites and these small chemicals, is again, it's kind of advanced, what we call analytical chemistry techniques, using really advanced chemistry techniques to say, look, I can't tell what this particular chemical is at this moment in time, but I think it consists of a number of smaller chemicals that might be bound to each other. And we sometimes artificially generate the chemical in a lab, run that through the machine and say, look, does that seem to have the same properties as what we think it might be, to try and compare and to try and come up with things. Or we might so those are the sort of approaches that you might use. So
is it too much of a scientific leap of faith? And I'm getting excited listening to you, because they could all be novel drugs. They could be, couldn't they? They could be, if they have some demonstrable, consistent effect on something that has a downstream therapeutic benefit, then they could be drugs. So,
I mean, we're kind of looking in more, we're looking in more environments than we ever did before, which I think also gives us access to. We're kind of looking in greater detail. I mean, for instance, there was a paper in a very renowned scientific journal, Nature, from a year or two ago, that looked at centenarians, and they took a whole load of centenarians and looked at what's the composition of their microbiome and what metabolites, what small chemicals do they produce. Now this isn't your average set of people that you might look at. These are very distinctive set of people. And they found particular bile acids that we don't really know very much about, but now we've seen them in this population. They're particularly prominent there. We can start to see them when we now look back at data we've already collected from other populations. You'll be aware, and other people will be aware, that there's been this idea about people living in tribal African communities who are eating, who obviously don't have any exposure to a Western diet or don't have any exposure to industrialization. Could could an aspect of that be that they've actually got a in inverted commas better microbiome? They've got a because they haven't had that sort of dent or hit to the microbes from in industrialization, westernization, antibiotics, fast foods, etc. And again, when you look at those sort of communities, you can see particular bugs and particular metabolites that you wouldn't see if you just start looking in Western populations. So I think there's aspects of we are getting more sophisticated in how we're looking at the samples and what we've got, but we also got open-minded enough to start looking at really unique sets of patients, study participants, etc., which is giving us some new insights into things as well. Yeah.
On the centenarian element, then, these are people who live to over 100 years old.
Yeah.
Right? They were sampled in what they call these blue zones, right, where they're like these are hot spots for people who just live really long. Was there also something to do with the fact that not only were they living long, they were living healthy?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they were like living a really long and healthy life.
Yeah, so to take that on, and one aspect of this was, as I think I mentioned, is in that study there was some particular new forms of bile acid that were identified, and then of course the whole premise of doing the study in the first place was look, if these people have got to 100, they must have something in their constitution that is kind of pretty good, and that one of those things might be that they're considering when the era in which these people were younger people, which was pre-antibiotic, maybe these people have got some pretty good defense against infectious disease, and they started testing some of these new bile acids identified in the study against different forms of infection, including some multi-drug resistant bugs, some antibiotic resistance bugs, including C.difficile that we've mentioned before, and some of these bile acids really just killed off those bugs really, really effectively.
Wow.
So
that's cool.
So again, that kind of added weight to the kind of initial premise that maybe that's part of the story. I mean, there could be a whole range of other factors that are relevant, that are relevant, including the genetics of these people, the immune system of these people, some luck in their upright, whatever it is. But but there is obviously something, and what drives that microbiome in the first place, be that diet, geography, whatever it is, that's also an area of debate. But whatever it is, the point is they had these bugs, they've got those metabolites, and they seem to, at least part of the story of that might be that they've got this particular super microbiome that is that can is pretty potent against pretty common infections.
Wow. Could one other aspect be there's other microbial metabolites or just the general composition of the microbiome promotes health in these people too? Have they done more analysis than just, the bile acids? Like diversity, was that higher?
So that's I can't remember about diversity specifically. In fact, they looked at kind of a number of different metabolites, and for some metabolite groups, including the short chain fatty acids, there wasn't such a clear prominent pattern. Perhaps that is kind of a bit more, perhaps that there's kind of, you're looking at 100-year-olds, there's kind of one aspect might be there's some aspects of when you look at a microbiome of a 100-year-old that is kind of a plotted history of what's happened over the past 100 years. Other aspects of what you look like might be what their diet or their health is like now. So you kind of might expect to see slightly different results in some metabolite groups, some microbiome aspects than you would others. So I think actually for short chain fatty acids, I recall there wasn't such a clear signal, but for bile acids in particular is where they saw this really clear picture. So
cool. So the BSG guidelines would prevent them from becoming a donor because they're over the age of 60.
Yeah.
So the question then is, would they be a good donor if they're 100 and they're healthy?
This is a great debate. I mean, I think as one example that we've spoken about before is for instance, there is some interest in the microbiome in its contribution to alcohol dependence and its relation to alcohol-related liver disease, and there's an increasing body of work showing the relevance of the microbiome to those aspects.
So the story there, Ben, is that they've got a different microbiome when you compare them to healthy people.
Yeah.
What about in animals? Like, is it harder to give people or animals alcoholic liver disease if they don't have a microbiome? There's some element to that as well.
Yeah, exactly, correct. So there is elements from that. Sometimes there's some difficulty from some animal models, and that it's some animal models just don't drink alcohol very well, but there are some there are some supportive data from that aspect of a sort of microbiome related aspect, both in terms of susceptibility to alcohol related liver disease and your appetite and your dependence on alcohol.
And there's been one study as well from Bajaj. I don't want to do him a disservice here, but my understanding is that in a small pilot study in patients with alcoholic hepatitis, they showed a reduced alcohol craving post FMT.
Yeah, exactly. Reduced alcohol craving post in patients with alcohol-related liver disease. I mean, the microbiome in terms of addiction and aspects of personality is then getting into a new field, but just briefly come back to that idea.
Let us talk about that.
Of donor. Say you wanted to design an FMT study for there. So that Bajaj study, as you say, was an FMT study where people seem to have reduced alcohol dependence after the procedure. But who do you pick as your donor? This is something we've discussed and others have discussed. Would you just pick a healthy donor who's got a total aversion to alcohol, or actually might you say, look, I will pick someone who actually is a bit of a drinker, but actually hasn't got any sort of alcohol-related liver disease, or can just have a binge now and again, but just can just drop it totally between then.
Interesting.
Because perhaps those sort of people, they've got the sort of constitution whereby they can take the alcohol, but it doesn't actually they can shake it off, or it doesn't cause them any harm or whatever. And then say there was some sort of biological plausibility that second scenario, the occasional heavy drinker was the donor you want to use. Would that be kind of ethically right to pick that person?
Right. Well, even on the former, I mean, if somebody's been on the booze heavy every day for the last, what shall we say, 10 years.
Yeah.
Okay. And I really mean heavy. But their liver function tests look good.
Yeah.
Rest of their parameters look good. Healthy, exercising, so on and so on. They meet all the other criteria. Would there be any argument to say well, hey, their microbiome might be protecting their liver
Yeah.
from cirrhosis, for example.
Yeah,
and if so, could they be a good donor?
I think plausibly you could kind of
you can make that case.
Make that case. But how you go forward with that, with the current level of knowledge you've got, with the current safety and regulatory focus that we rightly have, is really difficult.
And I would have to say, my view, and you've got a lot of experience in this area too, is it might be so hard to actually find those people. It's hard, it's hard because I don't even know where would you go. You'd go to the pub and say we're doing this thing.
That sets the bar. That sets the bar high. There are other particular sorts of scenario whereby you might select a particular donor on a particular situation. I mean, for instance, to give one example, to go back to that idea we discussed about a metabolic disease, including things like obesity and type 2 diabetes.
Yes.
There's been some study again from Max Nooydorp and colleagues in the Netherlands, whereby they took donors from they looked for donors for people who've had bariatric surgery. So in other words, that we think part of the reason that particular bariatric procedures work, particularly the most extensive procedure, Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, we think part of the reason for the success of that, based from mouse studies and some other work, is actually related to changes in the gut microbiome. In other words, that there might be that, as you described before, that additional energy harvest from our food, that the surgery might cause changes in bile acid flow, other aspects of our health that cause changes in the microbiome and may cause changes in energy harvest. And they actually perform procedures whereby they, I think our ethics board might struggle a bit more with this, where they used bariatric surgery recipients as kind of as donors with some intriguing results.
And they've also, I think, as I said, they do have seemingly an ability to pick quite interesting donor groups.
Yeah.
The obese donor, but also this post bariatric surgery.
Yeah.
Because is there a hypothesis then, Ben, that not only does the bariatric surgery change the anatomy, it also changes the microbes, and therefore they might have an effect?
Yeah. So if you take particular microbes from people that have had bariatric surgery, and you stick those into mice, particularly you stick those into obese mouse models, those bacteria can seem to engraft. Those bacteria can stick in the microbiome, and it can be associated with weight loss in the mice. So buoyed by the results of some of those style of experiments, then kind of the idea has here, could your post-bariatric surgery patient, but be some sort of master donor. But of course, it asks all those questions again about what could be the off-target effects of that, what could be the longer term results of that. I mean, one particular interesting aspect of that is when you look in the microbiome of people who've had bariatric surgery, the gut microbiome, you see it's particularly enrichment of a group of bacteria called Enterobacteriaceae. So that is a group of bacteria that we think of generally as bad guys. If you look at the microbiome of you or me, and we saw a lot of those sort of bacteria, we would probably think we're not going to be the greatest stool donors for C. diff or whatever it is, right? You think of those as bad guys, which just again kind of comes back to the complexity of these systems. That in some cases particular bacteria are beneficial, in other cases they're not beneficial. It's not just what's there, but what's the function of these bugs as well.
Yeah,
and it's in the context of all the other stuff that's going on, the environment that they're around in the gut as well. Yeah.
So let's move to your own experience in rational donor selection then. So what are you doing for some of your work at the moment? Are you implementing anything sophisticated to try and, I guess, in a sense, we're trying to enhance the probability of success, right?
Yeah, sure, exactly. So, we're trying to enhance the probability of success, but kind of also just trying to almost take a step back to drill down more into this relationship between microbiome, metabalome, and those aspects of health. And it kind of gets back to that element like we talked with the obesity studies of maybe the bar is too high to think one FMT is going to make obesity go away. But actually, can we start to get smaller gains and start to see some of those signals? So for instance, we're interested in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So it's the most common form of chronic liver disease in the world, affects approximately 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 of the global population to a lesser or greater degree.
Is it that high, Ben?
Depends on which study you might want to look at.
Goodness gracious!
Is increasing, and most Western populations will soon be the number one indication for liver transplantation.
Whoa, so hold on a second. So I think most people, when they think of cirrhosis, they think of alcohol,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But what we're saying here now is that potentially 1 in 3 people have non-alcoholic fatty changes.
Yep.
And then does that progress then over time in some people to cirrhosis
Yeah,
and ultimately transplant?
Correct. Yeah, exactly. So it's a proportion of people,
Whoa.
which, although we think of it as the minority of people, even the minority of a very large number is still a lot of people. Progress over time, and that
So
can
it's a tidal wave coming.
correct, and that can progress to exactly as you say, cirrhosis, the most advanced form of chronic liver disease, and all the complications that come with that, and that can include liver failure.
Yeah.
And people with cirrhosis also have an increased risk of liver tumours as well.
Right.
So yeah, so it's a pretty enormous pretty enormous burden of disease. Yeah, and part of my remit from a clinical perspective, so working as a sort of specialist fatty liver clinic in my hospital. The reason there is some that can be a difficult experience is we don't currently have any licensed medications for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. We don't have any specific medications. We are good at trying to promote lifestyle advice. We are good at trying to control comorbidities as a way of also impacting upon the disease, but we don't have any specific treatments, even though there are an enormous amount of active research for a number of different pharmaceutical agents. It's important to add a number of different pharmaceutical agents have gone by the wayside, have had negative trials or only shown modest benefits
in liver,
for liver-related outcomes. But that's part of the reason why microbiome aspects are as soon as we started to realise there might be a microbiome contribution to this, as there are for other metabolic diseases, that's clearly why the kind of liver community and doctors and scientists more generally have said, look, this is something we should really latch onto, because even if there is a chance that this might be contributory, we've got an enormous burden of pathology, enormous burden of suffering people who we want to try and help here.
Yeah, absolutely.
There have been some small FMT. There's been a number of different probiotics related studies in fatty liver disease that are really somewhat difficult to interpret, because they've been performed with different probiotics in different patient groups given for different amounts of time.
Right.
The overall conclusion, it's in the last NICE guidelines, it's in some other guidelines, it seems to be a modest benefit across a number of different metrics, but it's difficult to interpret for those reasons. There've been a number of different studies of FMT in the field of metabolic disease, metabolic syndrome, and 2 small studies in the field of fatty liver disease that suggest some benefit, but not all patients benefiting to an equal degree. And some of those are kind of looking at proxy to the disease rather than actually looking at things that as liver doctors you would kind of put as hard metrics. What we are doing at the moment is we taking this metabolic aspect. Is we looked at a huge amount of metabolic profiling of blood samples from a huge biobank, so a huge bioresource that we have of people we look after with fatty liver disease, and particularly sort of more advanced people, so people with more advanced disease, people we see regularly in clinic. And we compared those to a healthy population. In fact, this was a huge study of police officers where we weeded out the small number who had other medical conditions and kept in the sort of the majority of them who, as you might expect, are probably a little bit fitter than the general population.
Right.
And we looked at their metabolic profiles and how they separated, and which metabolites in their bloods were the ones that separated them. We then went back to a group of donors that we'd screened, and we said, look, which of those seem to be highest in those metabolites that we found more in the healthy population than our fatty liver population. And we kind of made a bit of a ranking of those. Now, was the ranking of those people exactly the same as you would see clinically to look at them in terms of things we think of with metabolic health? Were all of them, was it necessarily the one who was top was the thinnest or the youngest or the one who did the most half marathons or whatever it was? There was clearly a trend towards their clinical health being related to their metabolic profile, but it wasn't absolutely a direct link between who our donors were and their metabolite profiles. And at the moment, the work that's underway is select. We as I said, we've ranked these donors. We're picking out the ones who are kind of top on their metabolic profile,
Wow.
which we hope, which we expect is to at least some degree a proxy of what their gut microbiome is doing.
Sure.
And we're using those as the donors for patients with fatty liver disease. And what we're primarily looking for is to what extent can we transmit that beneficial metabolic profile from our donors to our recipients by trying to alter their gut microbiome. And we're using capsulized FMT, IMT products to try and do that. Yeah. And so that study's undergoing. It's too early to give you any sneak previews because it's only in its early stages. We accept that it's an exploratory study. We don't think that this is going to instantly wipe out NAFLD by itself, but we're hoping this will give us this. What we hope is this is kind of moving things onwards a bit and showing some proof of concept that maybe we can be a little bit smarter or biologically driven in how we might select donors for non-CTI studies.
I mean, is there any argument, Ben, to say, well, look, we're doing all this super extensive health questionnaire phenotypic screening to make sure that it's safe? Is there not by default some inference towards them having a particularly healthy metabolic profile as well? Surely, I mean, because we're doing all this additional work.
Yeah, exactly. So as you know, it's very well established clinical factors, health factors that are associated with the microbiome, and lots of those factors, as you say, are related to medication use, like the antibiotics, age, other aspects of health, comorbidities, etc. So in the donor screening, we are there is clearly going to be an overlap between who makes the cut of your donor screening and who are the people in a population who would have a good microbiome. There might be other things that we haven't even thought about, that the people who tend to kind of engage with FMT services might be people who are more health engaged in themselves, and so that might have some implications as well. So there are so yes, there is definitely a degree of overlap, but should we say simply all the people that make it for our screening? Well, we filtered a lot of people who are probably not so healthy, so basically anyone's all right. We're hoping we can do something a bit better.
More. Or maybe we could mix together microbiomes from different donors to. Should we talk about that?
Yeah,
the pooling element.
Yeah.
So it seems as though to me, and I suppose just for the listener, we're talking about mixing together the starting material from different donors to try and, I guess, do a number of things, but particularly in terms of the product characteristics, increase diversity, improve compositional consistency, uniformity, so on. So my understanding is that in ulcerative colitis now, there seems to be some sort of inclination towards pooling may be beneficial based on the work that's been done. But in your opinion, as like the expert in the field, is there any concrete evidence to say that pooling, is the right thing to do? Are we getting there, or? Okay, so I mean, I'm certainly aware of some microbiological data that's been presented whereby stool donors have been pooled and had a look at aspects that we consider proxies of a good microbiome, including diversity, in other words, the overall mixture of bugs you've got in the mix, and have shown that as you might expect, that actually mixing donors together gives you a greatly improved alpha diversity. It's one of the key metrics we looked at, and that in certain scenarios where we think that particular bacteria or particular groups of bacteria might be important to outcomes from, say, an FMT study. If it's missing in one donor, you're hoping if you might mix from a few donors, it might be present in another donor and make up the shortfall there. And the same with metabolites or anything else related to the microbiome you want to look at. So I've certainly seen some data in that regard, whereby pooling donors together kind of increases all those metrics. So have we, exactly as you say, there has been this sort of pool donor ulcerative colitis trial where the pooling looked to be an interesting element that might be associated with benefit. I think we're at too early a stage where we can say absolutely categorically that one aspect of pooling or not pooling is 100% the right way to go for all situations. But I think from everything we've seen, that pooling looks a really interesting way of doing it from the standpoint of biological rationale. Yeah. And is this something you think we'll see more of as we move forward now? Because we've got the proof of concept in UC. I mean, intuitively, I suppose if we're looking for bugs that have functionality, there's more chances of shots on goal if we're pooling.
Yeah, precisely. I think that's nicely summarised. I mean, another way of looking at it is when we have a look at a load of different conditions where we think the microbiome is important. At its very simplest, one metric that seems to come out time and time again that associates with the worst form of that condition or poorer health or whatever it is a reduced alpha diversity. So in a field that we're interested in, in relation to outcome after stem cell transplantation, I mentioned a little bit about that before.
Yeah.
When we look at patients, say with blood cancers who are having stem cell transplantation, and we look at their gut microbiome before they have the stem cell transplant, this is almost like clear dichotomy whereby people with lower diversity actually do worse, have worse outcomes. There was a big paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine a couple of years ago looking at this. So was
diversity predictive of success?
Yeah, precisely. So a lower alpha diversity seems to predict poorer outcomes, that people would have worse outcomes. So by analogy of this, whereby alpha diversity alone seems to be a metric that really seems to stick with predicting outcome, associating with worse disease for lots of different disease types. Pooling at its most basic seems to be a really effective tool for increasing alpha diversity. Right. Alpha diversity has been linked with engraftment as well. So this at its most simplest, that's why I think pooling might seems to be, from a biological standpoint at least, a really interesting approach.
Could be important. What do we know why lower diversity has an impact on the success of stem cell transplants, or is it very much this is emerging? Trying to understand.
I think it's still emerging. Whether that's some proxy of missing particular bacteria from the gut microbiome, or whether that's some more general proxy of different aspects of health, I don't know. There has been some a real growth of interest in the past few years about how the gut microbiome influences immune function. And obviously, these are people with blood cancers. These are people having an immune-related. We've got a condition that primarily affects their white cells, their immune system, and whether this is some sort of marker of that these people, by having this lower diversity of bugs, have some sort of lower stimulation or maturation signal to the immune system is a kind of area of interest, but it's still a pretty nascent phase.
Are we able to talk about your experience in stem cell transplants with FMT?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So where this all started from was I was referred a patient who had recurrent C. difficile infection, but also had a hematological cancer, and was being considered for stem cell transplantation, which was thought to be a life-saving treatment for him, the best treatment available. However, his hematologist also found that he was colonised with 2 antibiotic-resistant bacteria in his gut. And our hematologist had experience that for people like this, where they had undergone stem cell transplantation in the past, that these people were very high risk of that bug not just sticking in his gut after stem cell, but merging from his gut, passing into his circulation and making him septic, giving him an invasive infection after his stem cell transplant, when his immune system's just at his lowest, while he's waiting for the stem cell transplant to take hold.
Right.
And they've had experience of people end up in intensive care and even dying. And our hematologist said, look, we don't think we can give this guy a stem cell transplant because we've got no antibiotic. We've got very limited antibiotics to try and knock these bugs out if they pass into his circulation. And we've got no other strategies. So we had a sort of case discussion. Patient was closely consulted that we hadn't done this. There were some initial concerns about this being an immunosuppressed patient, us giving them an FMT, IMT.
Yeah.
So there was we actually consulted with MHRA as well for their standpoint on it. So, and the conclusion was, after discussion with all involved parties, we thought the risks, the benefits would outweigh the risk. While recognising there were cases to be made on both sides, we thought the benefits outweighed the risk. And we gave the patient an FMT IMT, and they went on about 2 or 3 weeks later to have the stem cell transplant.
So pre-transplant?
Pre-transplant, yeah.
Yep.
And what we found is that these two their C. diff went. They didn't have any problems with diarrhea. The C. diff disappeared from their guts, consistent with our experience elsewhere.
Yeah.
But the other real pleasant surprise was that these two antibiotic-resistant bugs just disappeared from the gut of this guy.
Wow.
We just couldn't detect them anymore. So based on our experience for that, we went on to kind of treat other patients in the same scenarios. So like you say, pre-stem cell transplant FMT, and we built this up to about a group of hematology patients, and basically the patients did very well, and particularly, I mean, firstly, our primary question was, are we going to stop these people getting invasive infection? Are we going to stop them getting bloodstream infections with antibiotic-resistant bugs? And we definitely saw a fall off to what we might expect, or compared to patients we've had in the past with these bugs. We definitely saw an improvement in outcomes. Was every patient's experience exactly the same? No, there was variability. Some patients did have some complications. There was some variability, but overall, comparing the sort of patients we looked after historically, comparing to these patients, there was a clear, benefit. When we statistically analysed this and published this work as well, very clear as a benefit. But then the other surprising element was not just related to the invasive infection, but how these patients did from a haematological aspect. So our haematologists started to say, look, these patients are kind of doing well, like really well. Wow. Like their stem cell transplant seems to be kicking in, working better. Wow. They're not having as many complications. And unfortunately, given how severe some of these blood cancers are and how severely sick people with stem cell transplants are, we do measure, do people die after the stem cell transplant? Are people alive or not? And it was very clear that the people were, that patients were doing really well. That they were the stem cell transplant was kicking in. They were living healthy lives.
Incredible. Were they quite excited?
Yeah. So they're very excited.
Yeah.
Based on some of the results of this, we actually had some of our renal physicians who look after patients with renal transplantation and other complex aspects of renal disease or urological disease come to us and say, hey, look, we've heard you've had these good outcomes with these people with
hospital gossip.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. With you remember it well, James. With multi-drug resistant bugs, and can we use FMT on these patients? And these particularly patients who are getting recurrent urinary tract infections with bugs that are very difficult to treat. And you may say, why give them an FMT if they've actually got an infection of the urinary tract? Well, lots of these urinary tract infections, the rationale is the bug is in the gut. Yeah. And then moves from the gut through to the bladder and the urinary tract system, and we also started to see benefits there in terms of fewer urinary tract infections with these bugs. So again, same sort of experience. Did we have no patients having infection at all? No. Was the pattern that people were having fewer infections, and when they did get infections, they were easier to treat? Yes, that's what we observed. Yeah.
This is incredible, isn't it? I think, imagine going back in time to 2012 when you started to get interested in it and your future self said, hey, by the way, Ben, this is what we're doing now. You probably would have been like, no way, we're giving them pre-stem cell transplantation. We're decolonizing the gut of MDROs.
Yeah, I mean, again, incredible. we talked about, starting FMT in the first place and C. diff and were we sure it was going to work, and what was the point where we really bought into this really works. And again, I remember going into this first patient for pre-stem cell transplant. He was so immunosuppressed, I had to have my full PPE on with my bag full of my fecal transplant material, and thinking, this feels wrong. Here I am with an immunosuppressed patient with my full PPE on. But I've got enormous quantities of bacteria I'm about to pump into them. Yeah, and really unsure if we were doing the right thing. But again, that pinch point came where it became hard to refute that there is something really clearly there.
So are you and your team now really strong in the conviction that IMT, FMT, microbiome therapies are going to have an impact in cancer patients?
Yes. Yeah, I think we can say that pretty confidently, and from different aspects. One, I think there's scenarios like this, and I think an area that's been of increasing excitement, over the past couple of years, is related, kind of in the same category, but more broadly, is can microbiota modulation impact in how anti-cancer therapies work.
Yeah.
And of course, where one area that's been a particular area of focus has been related to immunotherapy.
Yeah.
So immunotherapy is by almost any standards a wonder drug for different forms of cancer, in that these are used in often used in really difficult to treat cancers. They're often very tragic cases. For instance, they might be young people with very advanced melanoma that spread to different organ systems, but they're used in a wide variety of cancers, and they're difficult to treat. And these immunotherapies, they when they work, they can work really spectacularly for cancers that we had no treatment for before. But what has become really interesting really quickly is this apparent relationship between our microbiome, and particularly our gut microbiome, and how effectively these cancers work. That again, we didn't even know the gut microbiome was relevant for anything 10 or 20 years ago. And not only have we got here, a drug that has come from nowhere that is brilliant for some people, has won the Nobel Prize, etc. But now we've discovered that the gut microbiome is entirely relevant to how this drug functions or not. For people who've got therapeutic nihilism about nothing changes in medicine, or it changes slowly, then this is the perfect poster boy antidote to that. There is this profound aspect to the gut microbiome. Some colleague I work with, David Pinato, has performed an analysis looking at people who'd had antibiotics prior to immunotherapy, and found that people who might be expected to live to have an additional 18 months of life with effective immunotherapy can be reduced to only 3 months of life if they've had antibiotics recently and the immunotherapy doesn't work. So there's this really marked influence.
Goodness me. That's huge, isn't it?
It's this really, profound influence.
Yeah.
And then, you'll be familiar with, and that other people may be familiar, that there's been these sort of 2 studies published already about looking at, FMT to try and boost the response of immunotherapy that looked really interesting. Again, kind of, as we described before, is this every single patient did absolutely perfectly and did brilliantly? No. But did some patients really profoundly appear to, benefit from it? Then clearly. And these are patients who have a very limited number of alternative therapeutic options.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't understand it as well as many people do, but my understanding is that there are various different types of response, like a complete response, partial response, so on. And there have been cases of complete response in non-responders post FMT-IMT.
Yeah, correct.
Which is, well, first of all, it's fascinating, but it really offers, I think, hope for patients and families battling these horrific diseases, which do take lives away very early.
Yeah, absolutely. And another really fascinating aspect is how this relates to the donor selection aspects that we discussed earlier.
Yeah, I've got a note to talk about that. I'm glad we've got there.
but in both the studies that were kind of published together a year or two ago, the donors for this were cancer patients who'd been treated with immunotherapy who had responded very effectively, and it was their poo that was collected and used.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's kind of like our the scenario we suggest about the someone who's alcohol dependent but no liver disease. In some ways, it makes perfect biological sense. Here's someone who responded to the drug. Yep. We know how the drug works is related to the microbiome. Surely they're the perfect person to use. Yeah. On the other hand, this is someone who got cancer in the first place. Indeed. And we don't know the pushes and pulls of why they got cancer.
Indeed.
And we might suspect that their microbiome could at least be some sort of contributor potentially to that. So this is where we start to get into a very tricky sort of area.
And I suppose with the toolkit that you're working with, you and your team and others might be able to decipher what element of the responder microbiome is driving the response in the patient, and therefore we could maybe look for that in a healthy person to reduce the risks elsewhere.
Exactly. Yeah,
that's exactly what I think you guys are trying to do, isn't it? Broadly speaking.
Yeah, exactly. I think as we've said, are we saying that FMT or IMT is a miracle cure for every single patient in every scenario? Of course we're not saying that. No. But when we start to look in non-C. diff surroundings, such as this immunotherapy example, such as other scenarios we talked about, like stem cell transplantation, recurrent urinary tract infection, are there some people that seem to get clear clinical benefits? Then yes. And if we can start to say, look, for those patients that got benefits, can we start to link that with those people got something? There was some aspect of either the FMT they received, or there's some aspect of their host microbiome to begin with that might influence, their response to the FMT. Then that is a starting point. Myself and some of my other colleagues in the field say that at the very least, FMT is a really important exploratory technique for letting us, delve more into the contribution of microbiome to different conditions.
Yep, discovery tool is what I've heard of before. So both a therapeutic intervention and discovery tool. It's a great thing. How is it going to evolve over the next 5 years then, in your opinion? Another big question, man. I'm really getting you with the big ones.
Yes, you are. You're hitting me with the big ones here, James. I think some of those are related to aspects that are. I mean, some things won't go away. I mean, I think donor aspects are, donor screening, etc., is not going to go away. Yeah. We are clearly segging towards aspects of preparation that are improved. And while those aspects of preparing things in ambient air with a blend or whatever, those are all ancient history.
It's on the way out, right? Or is it out? Is it done now?
I think it's done. It's on its last legs at the very least. But I think those aspects of having a standardized, reproducible pipeline with very well phenotype, characterized, well screened donors is going to be the bare minimum for where we're going.
For sure.
We still do work with FMT slurries, other people using endoscopic approaches. There may be different scenarios whereby you different modes of application might be appropriate, but clearly in terms of the technology we have, in terms of patient acceptability, in terms of our ability in some cases to target delivery to bits of the gut that we want to, different forms of capsulized delivery is evidently the way of the future. Are we going to stick with a perfectly ideally made full FMT, or are we going to be moved on to something next generation?
Well, this is the podcast episode in itself, isn't it? This is the big one.
That is the big one. I mean, again, we gave a sort of parallel of blood transfusion before, and I've heard a number of people talk and say, look, in the early days of blood transfusion, everyone said we're not going to be giving blood to people in years' time. We have just taken each individual element, we'll found out all the bits that work, we'll shove them all together, and we'll give that some fake blood, and that'll work, and we don't have to take blood out of people the whole time. And obviously, it's never happened, because the real deal, the full material, is clearly the best thing. I know it's not a perfect analogy, but there is obviously some parallels. And that might be where we are, that we say there is something about an entire gut ecosystem, or there are aspects that we can't characterize. Like we said, if we don't know all the bugs in there, we don't know all the metabolites in there, we've got an imperfect understanding of the functions, we don't know which aspects of the environment are important. 100%. Maybe we're best sticking with the real deal and sticking with the whole ecosystem. Yeah. But maybe there are scenarios where we say, look, we have moved on, we accept that FMT or IMT is not risk-free. We've spoken extensively about donor screening. Maybe there are at least certain scenarios where we say, look, we've used FMT as a discovery tool to find out particular bugs or particular metabolites or particular proteins that bugs make that we want to exploit and use as a novel targeted therapy. We already use, we've already combed our way through nature, picking out new drugs, picking out drugs for years, digoxin, etc. We've combed our way a little bit through bacteria and exploited some drugs, streptokinase, asparaginase, etc. But, maybe we are at a sort of new field where we can say, look, we're actually going to exploit whole microbiomes for the functions we can pull out and give those into novel targeted therapies. Yeah. It's worked when we've done it in plants. It's worked when we've done it in for particular individual bacteria. Maybe we're just moving on to doing what we've done before, but in a whole community setting.
Indeed, the cures might be living within us right now. They might all be in there in some way, in some shape or form. And some other people saw a paper published 2 days ago in Nature. They'd mined the microbiome to try and find antimicrobial peptides, and they generated a couple for Pseudomonas. Yeah. So, indeed, I think there's this immense and vast treasure. Was it called treasure trove?
Yeah, treasure trove. Yeah.
Forgive me. Treasure trove of potentially therapeutically active compounds, chemicals, proteins in the gut. And it sounds to me like
And we focused a lot of our discussion here on bacteria. We haven't even really touched the surface of non-bacterial components.
Indeed.
And of course, there are a huge amount of research into bacteriophage, the enormous number of viruses that actually live within the gut microbiome, that live within bacteria there, and where there's a huge amount of enthusiasm of exploiting the intrinsic properties of those viruses to sometimes damage or kill bacteria. And obviously, we've got so embedded in other themes that we haven't even touched on that. But there's these huge aspects of the microbiome, biology of the microbiome, where we've really just, to use a cliche, scratched the surface of what we understand.
Yeah, I'm sure you get people coming to you, patients, public, friends, family, saying things like, "What do I need to do to improve my microbiome? Do I take probiotics? Yes or no?" How do you respond to these kinds of questions at the moment, based on what we know?
Yeah, I say that I generally say this is a really rapidly emerging field, and we are still in the early days of it. There are clearly some, as doctors, we are obliged to only advise people on where there is evidence-based scenarios. Is there some, are we all convinced there being an evidence base for prebiotics in certain scenarios? Yes. Are there certain well-defined scenarios where we think probiotics, we've got trial data, they're beneficial? Yes, there are. But there are a lot of areas at the moment where we think probiotics are maybe generally beneficial for health, but we don't have really specific data that there are, have an evidence-based improvement for conditions. Yes, that's the scenario we're up to. For FMT, there are obviously defined indications and, of course, a really active research field. Do we know aspects that affect the microbiome generally that improve? Are we convinced that microbiome feeds into huge aspects of our health? Yes. Do we know aspects that we can change in our lifestyle, and otherwise that impact the microbiome? Do we all believe that the microbiome is a mediator in beneficial changes in lifestyle and impacts upon the health? I think we're all pretty sold on that. Yes. But so on the one hand, that's a bit frustrating, because I realise that sounds a bit vanilla and sounds a bit general. But I think we just have to say that we have some clear-cut evidence-based areas we know. Right. We are at the early part of a big journey, and it's clearly an area that's going to rapidly expand and evolve.
This vision of going to your doctor and getting your microbiome profiled, and then being able to say, right, I've had a look at this, and based on everything else that we know about you, you need this probiotic and this prebiotic. Yeah. Are we there yet, or
no? I don't think we are. I do get a lot of emails about this where people have had have had microbiome profiling, or have had particular chemicals in their stool analysed or whatever. There are different aspects of that are a bit concerning to lots of clinicians. One is about the standards used to actually do the profile in the first place. These are not easy tests to necessarily do. They're technically demanding tests to do. The other aspect is about who is the reference population. So some people say, look, my 5-year-old child with autism, I've had their stool profiled, and my child has this particular profile, and the reference group, they say is the healthy population, has this particular profile. We say, well, who is the reference population for all these healthy 5-year-olds? Who's done this profiling? So that's another aspect of it. And then thirdly, most fundamentally, just having higher levels or lower levels of one bug or particular chemicals at a snapshot on one moment in time without any wider context tell us anything valuable only in an extremely limited number of cases. Yep. I would say. Yeah.
And is it fair to say that those limited cases, based on what we understand now, are if there's a pathogen in there or
correct.
Not? Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, correct.
Yep.
I think
good takeaway for the listeners.
I think that's essentially it. What may add, may be of interest is there is a current move for a whole group of global stakeholders, microbiologists, clinicians, etc., who are planning on trying to address this very topic. Actually,
oh really? What's that called?
Which Gianluca Iannero and colleagues in Italy are leading, which are trying to bring together as kind of a global stakeholder group of experts from a sort of microbiome, microbiology, clinical medicine background to explore this very topic. Is there a role for these sort of tests for individualized, personalized medicine, personal microbiome profiling tests? And if there is, what are those scenarios, and what would be the expected standards, reference ranges, clinical implications of having those tests done. So that work is only at the stage of just getting a group of interested parties together at the moment.
Amazing. Well, I'll be able to ask him about that when he comes on then. I'm sure he'll have lots to say. So this is great. So we're moving in the right direction then, essentially, to be able to give people the answers they want. Because it must be, in some respects, quite distressing as a clinician when you've got a desperate patient coming to you, presenting this that they've paid for, and you saying, well, look, it's not really.
Yeah, it comes back to what we discussed earlier about desperate people saying, "Well, I want to do a DIY FMT because I've run out of options, whatever." And this is the really hard scenario as a clinician, saying to people, "Look, I accept that you've tried, a range of different things for looking into diagnosis or for treatment, and you're really desperate because of the impact of the condition on your quality of life. However, you've always got to balance that against that doing stuff that doesn't have any sort of basis. We cannot, as clinicians, give people false hope. While we want to go on a journey with our patients and give them hope for treatments, and the microbiome is obviously an area where there is massive hope because of the speed at which things are changing. Similarly, we are doing a disservice if we recommend to people stuff that can do them harm, or we give people false hope, or we give them platitudes of things that we just don't think are going to work. It's not a professional thing to do.
Right.
It's not being their advocate. Yeah.
But what I think a recurring theme over the course of this conversation is that there's good reason to be hopeful.
Yeah, precisely. I think if there's the take-home message for this is that there is an enormous amount of hope, and there is enormous speed of progress in so many domains. I mean, I think that perhaps reflecting on what we've discussed, that scenario we mentioned of that maybe 10 or 15 years ago we didn't have immunotherapy as a treatment, and we didn't know the microbiome really existed, and now we know the microbiome is a major impact on your immunotherapy. And this is a condition before this both these aspects play into treatments that are absolutely life-changing and life-saving and it didn't exist 15 years ago. So for anyone who perceives there's a slow pace of change or hangs on to therapeutic nihilism, then that is a perfect counter to it.
Amazing. Dr. Ben Mullish, thank you very much.
Cheers, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.